Good morning, Year 10. It's Mrs Edwards again, bringing you lesson number 2. Just a reminder, if you've got any issues, you can feel free to email me on the email on the slide. There'll be extra videos on the YouTube channel, our Taylor JFC History, and Mondays I'm available on Teams. There might be other days I'll pop in and stuff, but Mondays I'll be there all day, ready for answering any questions, or if you want to let me know or show me anything. So we're going to finish looking at the Liberal reforms, but we're going to look at how the government tried to improve the nation's health. Last week we looked at why they did it. We looked at the Liberal reformers of Rowntree and Booth. We looked at the Boer War and how the amount of unfit soldiers to be recruited for the army was worrying for the government. And we also looked at some political tensions which made the Liberal government want to be the one for the people. So let's see how much you remember. So these are the questions that you answered last week. So just pause the video now and have another go at these 5 questions. Okay, so let's see how you did. So what percentage of the recruits were rejected during the Boer War because they were unfit? It was between 38 and 40%. 2 ways that Rowntree influenced the actions of the Liberal government. Well, he published a study of York in 1901 which showed more than a quarter of the people in York were living in poverty, and then he also showed the links between poverty and ill health. Charles Booth concluded in his survey that the government should take responsibility for caring for people in poverty. By 1900, the life expectancy for men in Britain was around 46 years of age, and the key dates of the first 2 Public Health Acts were 1848 and 1875. So hopefully you got 5 out of 5 on that. So today we're going to look at how did the government try to improve the nation's health after 1900. So you're going to know and explain the Liberal reforms that took place between 1906 and 1914, and you're also going to evaluate the effectiveness of these reforms, and there will be a second video on our YouTube channel which will show you evaluating the Liberal sources, but I'll talk more about that as we go forward. So who are these men? Well, the first one is Asquith, who became Prime Minister in 1908. He was he was a the Liberal leader. Next, we've got David Lloyd George, who served as Asquith's Chancellor of the Exchequer. Okay, he actually became Prime Minister of Britain at the end of 1916, early 1917. But he was a really prominent part in the Liberal reforms. He was the one kind of driving these alongside this guy, Winston Churchill. Now I've done a picture of Winston Churchill during this time because it's really easy to see what Churchill looked like, particularly as we know him from the Second World War. But in some sources you will see a young Winston Churchill, so you can see what he looks like in those sources. I've done a picture of him closer to that age, and Winston Churchill was rising quite well in the political ladder, but by sort of 1908 he started to really realise that actually Britain living in poverty was not good, and he wanted to try and help rectify this and have more Liberal reforms, and he began to push for employment benefits and unemployment insurance as well. So this was the first time, the Liberal Party, that the government fully intervened with public health. Lloyd George wanted to publish what was known as his People's Budget, and there's a video on the People's Budget on the JFC YouTube channel that I spoke about last week. So you might have already watched it, which would be brilliant. And he wanted to increase taxes to be able to pay for the money for these new reforms that he wanted to implement. However, it was refused in the House of Lords and actually caused 2 general elections in 1910, whereby the Liberals won. Labour was criticising Lloyd George because you had to be 70 plus to get a pension. Lots of Conservatives said the pensions and unemployment benefit would actually make people lazy. So there was an awful lot of people not particularly happy with what was happening, causing a lot of political tension. But actually for the People's Budget, he really pushed to have this People's Budget. A lot of David Lloyd George's reforms, a lot of people say they were based on those by Otto von Bismarck. So if you remember when we did Germany and we looked at Kaiser Wilhelm II and the sort of state welfare he'd brought in to kind of appease people to stop socialism from spreading, it was a similar kind of tactic that David Lloyd George was trying to implement. So he's like our star of the show. So this is a cartoon that shows Asquith, David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill in their pyjamas working late at night in their attempt to pass radical legislation to improve the life of the poor, 1909. So this is just to show you what they could look like in a cartoon. So this guy over here, we've got Asquith leading the way. Obviously he is the leader of the party, closely followed by David Lloyd George, with, you know, possibly his toolkit for success to bring all these new ideas together. And then right at the back, you probably don't fully recognise him, but that is Winston Churchill, obviously in his youth. So if you have a liberal reform cartoon, you could have these three characters in here. David Lloyd George is recognisable by his moustache. So in some of the sources that you'll look at in another video that I've produced, you will see that his moustache is very prominent. And there they are, burning the midnight oil with their candles, in their pyjamas, going to pass radical legislation. And there is a story that apparently Winston Churchill turned up to the Houses of Parliament once in his pyjamas because he was trying to pass through this legislation. So just gives you an idea of what people thought about that as well. So how did the Liberals tackle the issue of poverty? Well, after 1906, the Liberal government, with David Lloyd George as Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced reforms to help these three groups. So we've got children and young people, we've got the elderly, and we've also got workers. So what did they do? Well, they introduced a variety of measures. So in 1906, free school meals for children were brought into play. All births had to be reported to the local medical officer in 1907, and then a health visitor visited each mother to make sure that she knew how to protect her baby's health. And there were also free medical checks for children in school. In 1906, old age pensions introduced for people over 70 who did not have enough money to live on in 1908. 1909, new laws enforced higher standards of house building. 1911, we've got the National Insurance Act to help the sick, and 1912, the clinics set up to provide free medical treatment for children in school. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to pause the video now, and I'd like you to have a go at writing down this timeline in your books. You can do it like I've done it on this slide, or you can do it in your own sort of format. But as you're doing so, can you write down whether it affected children, the elderly, or workers next to it, just so you've got it clear. So pause the video now and have a go at writing those down. So just to give you a little bit more detail on these new reforms, I'm going to go through them quite quickly, but obviously you have got the time to pause these and add extra notes to your book underneath your timeline for each of these things. So please do have a go at adding to them and pausing it. Apologies for going through it quite fast. So free school meals meant that children from poor families were entitled to have a meal, and the meals were to be paid for from the local rates or the local taxes. By 1914, over 150,000 children were having a daily free meal every day, and for some children that could be the only meal that they might properly have. They might have like a snack or something at home, but that could be their only meal they have in the day, so it made a huge difference. However, less than half the education authorities in England and Wales provided the free meals. So for those that got it, it was fantastic, but not everyone was introducing it. And the good thing about free school meals is that even today, if we think about the significance of free school meals, even today, children still have access to free school meals. And in 1914, the government made it compulsory for those authorities to provide these meals. So it became more significant by 1914 because it was compulsory to provide them. They're significant today because people are still entitled to have them. We've got school medical inspections. Doctors and nurses went into schools to provide free compulsory medical health checks for children. It might be the first time that they've ever seen a doctor or nurse in their lifetime since birth, and maybe even ever. They could recommend any treatment that was necessary, but unfortunately, the sort of negative was any treatment required by the children had to be paid for by the parents until 1912, and that meant that actually for some parents they might know what's going on with their child, but they might not be able to afford the treatment still, so it wasn't completely great for them. Then we've got the Education Act in 1907, which introduced scholarships for children from poor families. So secondary schools that received money from local government were to reserve 25% for children from elementary schools, and children were chosen for scholarships through examination. Then we've got the Children's Act in 1908, also known as the Children's Charter. So children were now protected by law against cruelty from their parents. Poor law authorities were responsible for visiting and supervising children who had suffered cruelty or neglect. Children's homes had to be registered and inspected. Those under 14 who committed crimes were now not to be sent to adult prisons. Special juvenile courts were set up to try children accused of crime, so they were treated as a child rather than being treated as an adult when they're not quite an adult. Criminal children were to be sent to borstalls, specially built to cope with young offenders. Children under 14 not allowed into pubs. So there was lots of changes to safeguard children now. So rather than them, running around being riotous and those that were being put into adult prisons, there was a lot more safeguarding put in place to make sure that children were protected, and if they did wrong, fair enough, but made it so it was fairer and more in line with their age how they were punished. Also, cigarettes or alcohol were not to be sold to children under 16. So they're starting to realise that actually children under the age of 16 need a little bit more help and support. They shouldn't be treated like adults. So there's quite a big mindset and change happening. Then you've got the Old Age Pensions Act. So weekly pensions provided by the government for the elderly. Full amounts were only paid to those who earned less than £21 per year. For British citizens who had lived there for 20 plus years, and not for anyone who had been in prison during the 10 years before claiming their pension. So if you'd been in prison maybe 2 years before you wanted to claim your pension, you wouldn't be able to access it. And the first pensions were paid in January 1909 and were actually very popular among the pensioners. Then you've got the Labour Exchanges Act. Which meant that the unemployed could go to an exchange to look for a job. It's a bit like the first job centre. So if you need a job and you're struggling, you can go to a job centre. And this was the same principle. They were much more efficient for those seeking a job and those offering them. By 1913, there were 430 exchanges in Britain, which was a huge achievement. Then you've got the National Insurance Act, So all manual workers and people in low paid jobs had to join. Workers paid 4 shilling for insurance stamps, which they stuck on a special card. The government gave money into the scheme as well as the employers, and then if the worker in the scheme fell ill, they got sick pay for 13 weeks, but then it got reduced if they needed a further 13 weeks in the year, which is kind of similar to how sick pay can work today. So you can get full sick pay and then you can go down to half sick pay depending on how long you are off for. And workers in the scheme also were entitled to have free medical care, but that was just the workers. It didn't affect your family. So if your family were ill, they couldn't use any of these benefits. Then there was an amendment the following year, so the scheme opened up to those in industries where there was seasonal employment. Workers, employers and governments all paid for their insurance stamps, and when unemployed workers could be paid up for money for up to 15 weeks in any 1 year. So for those that had seasonal work and couldn't always guarantee employment for the full year round, it gave them a little bit of a safety net for 15 weeks, which was really useful. So although there were 10 million men and 4 million women covered by the National Insurance Scheme, a second act was necessary to deal with workers who found themselves periodically out of work. So those that worked, for example, maybe going and helping in the farming industry when it was harvest. So how effective were these reforms? So I've done a little table which has got a few things to help you out. So I've done green to show the positives, red to show sort of the limitations of the acts that were passed. What I would like to do is I would like to answer this question. I'd like to pause the video and answer this question now in your books and explain how effective were these reforms. You can use this table and obviously all the information I've given just now on the previous slides. You can rewind if you want to, but can you explain in your books a paragraph how effective were these reforms? Were they really good? Were they mediocre? They were okay, they started to make some amendments, or do you think they didn't really help anyone at all? Or who do you think they were more effective for? Was there a particular group of people that benefited the most? So pause now and have a go at answering how effective were these reforms. Okay, so to summarise, summarise, this is something I found in one of the textbooks that I've got and I thought I would share with you all. You could remember these public health improvements with the following way. So Lloyd George and the Liberal reforms opens the door for further public health improvements. So old age pensions, education for mothers, national insurance, school meals and medical checks. Okay, so that's a really good way. You might want to pause and write that down. It's a really good way to remember all the public health improvements. So a few tasks that I would like you to have a go at doing, and if you struggle with any of these or you would want me to check your answers, please email me them or drop me a message on Teams as well, in the History Teams chat, and I can go through and have a look. But also to help you, I found that on BBC Bitesize, if you search for the Liberal reforms 1906 to 1914, there's a few bits in there that will help you go through what I've gone through as well. So the first question I'd like to answer is, which group benefited the most from these Liberal reforms? Explain your reasoning. And then, can you explain the significance of the Liberal reforms? And I would like 3 reasons. I've given you some sentence starters, and remember to consider the long-term and short-term impact of these reforms and whether their significance, their importance, was limited because of particular factors. So pause the video now and have a go at answering those questions, please. Just to let you know, on our JFC History R Taylor YouTube channel, I will also be putting an extra PowerPoint which is going through these 2 Liberal sources. It'd be really useful for you to watch to help you understand, and I'll also put the sources in the files on Teams. So please check that out. I'll put a link on Teams as well. It will be really very useful. So to finish today, let's have a go at these 8 questions, these plenary questions. So have a go, pause now, have a go and see how you get on. So all the answers are in your fact book anyway, but let's have a look at the answers. So what age could people get an old age pension after 1908? People over 70. 3 examples of how young people benefited. You could have anything from free school meals, free medical checks, health visitors for young children. Which group of people benefited from the National Insurance Act? It was people in work. Who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer? It was David Lloyd George. Some people describe these Liberal welfare reforms as state welfare, okay? And state welfare is all about making sure that everyone has access to this new changes, okay? What year did working men get the vote? It was 1867. If you remember, that was on our PowerPoint that we did last week on your timeline. Which political party were elected in 1906? It was the Liberal Democrats. And what year were free school meals introduced? 1906. Thank you very much. Well done, Year 10, and I'll see you next week.